Thank you, Kyle, and welcome everyone to our 2021-22 OSHA Dairy LEP webinar update. Today's webinar is co-hosted by OSHA, the New York Dairy OSHA Workgroup, and a special thanks, of course, to Farm Credit East for graciously offering to host the OSHA updates and making the recordings available for all of us. Thank you to NEDPA, NICAM, Cayuga Marketing, New York Farm Bureau, Cornell's Ag Workforce Program, and to OSHA for our collective and collaborative work to offer outreach and education on farm safety and OSHA compliance. So as you work on continuous improvement for farm safety in the programs on your farm, we ask you to not only think about employees, but also others who come on to the farm. We are aware of fatalities both inside and outside of New York that unfortunately have involved visitors on our farms. As you take notes today, we hope that you write down, review, or develop your visitor policy. What is your visitor policy on your farms? Do visitors have to sign in? Do they wear safety vests? What are the protocols? What are the safety protocols during construction on your farm? Do the folks that are there doing construction on your farm understand what the visitor policy and safety protocols are on your farm? Are your workers aware of what those protocols are around construction on the farm? Are visitors allowed to just walk around or drive around your farm? These are all things that we hope that you think about when you review and or develop your visitor safety policy. And if you have any questions or comments or are looking for ideas, you can always ask or talk with our trusted resources at NICAM about developing or enhancing a visitor policy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim Caraba.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. I'm going to talk about some simple things you can do to keep your farm as safe as possible. So you really want to think about building a culture of safety on your farm, and to do that, it's got to really start from the top. So model, the owners, the managers, the supervisors really have to model safe behaviors and lead by example. And a good, really important thing to do is have ongoing safety and health training that occurs throughout the year. So safety training really should be occurring, periodically at all times throughout the year. And it's these safety messages that I think if you repeat them frequently, that helps you to build that culture of safety in your organization, on your farm. And it also shows employees that you're committed to safety. If you're taking the time to do safety training, they see that you're putting importance and value on that. And of course, the training needs to be delivered in a language and a vocabulary that workers can understand. And new hires have to have safety training before they're exposed to the hazards of their job. So whatever those specific hazards are, they need to be trained on how to keep themselves safe before they start doing those tasks. And this could be part of your onboarding process too. And I know the Cornell Agricultural Workforce Development Program has a very nice onboarding program that they've developed for farms. So, and I know they have made safety training a key component of that onboarding program. And then provide job and machine specific hands-on training as needed for employees. Some specific required annual training could be found in the OSHA regulations for tractor safety. So there's some specific items in there that have to be trained, that people have to be trained on annually. And then another OSHA regulation, the guarding of farm field equipment, farmstead equipment, cotton gins. There's some specific annual training requirements in that regulation for farm machinery and farm machines. And then if you're under the EPA's worker protection standard, there's some very specific annual training that has to be done with those workers every year. Other training that you could do at least annually might include things like animal handling, skid steer, payloader, telehandler, like any other types of heavy equipment you might have on your farm, and then hazard communication and chemical safety, which is going to be the main focus of our webinar today. And then also you may have to retrain somebody if there's a change to the work site, like if you got a new machine or you changed things about a building or added a new barn or something like that. people would have to be trained on those items. If you observe anybody perform an unsafe work practice, or if they have a close call or an incident, you need to take that worker or that employee off to the side and maybe retrain them so that they better understand how to do that task safely. A good thing that you could do throughout the year is provide like a tailgate type safety training session. And these are just a couple of minutes, informal training session on some very specific topic. And what I've always recommended to farms is try to do some tailgate type training, maybe at least twice a month. And that way you're keeping the message fresh in people's minds, and it's a good way to keep it ongoing throughout the year without tying up a lot of time. One thing you could think about maybe is having a different employee deliver that each time, because the best way to really learn a subject is when you have to teach it. So people really internalize things that way if they're the ones that actually have to teach it. And there's a lot of resources out there that you could download that could help you to do this. And you can always contact us if you wanted help finding those type of materials. And then document any of the safety training that you do. So have a sign-in roster, and I'd put the date on it, who the trainer was, the subject matter that you covered, and then have the employee sign in or have the employee's name on that. And then if you want to take it to the next level, best practice maybe is any materials you use to deliver that training, maybe keep those on file with your rosters as well. And that might help you in the future too, when you know, the next year when you go back to do training again, or just to show what you've covered too. And now I'll touch upon PPE, or personal protective equipment. So the employer should really identify hazards and tasks that workers have to do, and think about, well, if there's a hazard, what can we do to minimize that hazard and make that job safer? And really PPE would be your last line of defense. So if you determine that PPE is really needed to keep that worker safe, the employer has to provide the PPE at no cost. And a good thing to think about is maybe try to find personal protective equipment that workers like. If they like it and it's comfortable, it fits them well, or they like the look of it and that kind of thing, they're more likely to use it. In NICAM, we sell different types of personal protective equipment. So you could go to our website to see that. And then there's a lot of other vendors that offer this equipment too. So it's, you know, it's out there, it's readily available. Another thing, NICAM, we sell retrofit PTO shields that are very cost effective, and they fit about 90% of the PTO shafts that are out there. So this has been a good thing that we've been able to provide in the past years. We still have the RUPS rebate program. So if you have older tractors out there without roll bars, you might be able to retrofit those older tractors with RUPS and seatbelts through our program. And if you do that, you won't pay more than $500 out of pocket cost, because tractor overturns are still the biggest killer of farmers in the United States. So having roll bars and seatbelts will do a lot to prevent those deaths. And then NICAM, we are still available to go out there to do on-farm safety work. So we can do safety surveys, which safety walkthroughs, any type of safety training on farms. And then we also provide first aid and CPR training at no cost to farm workers and farm families. And we can come to a farm meeting and do safety presentations as well. So that's all available at no charge through grant funding that we get. So thank you. You know, always reach out to us if you want safety training or safety walkthrough, or you just have a question about some safety issue and you want more information on it. We can help you that way as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So my name is Nick D'Onofrio, and I'm a compliance assistance specialist with OSHA in Region 2. Before we get to our guest speaker, I would like to briefly cover a few topics related to dairy farming. I'd like to review OSHA's top 10 violations from fiscal year 21, and specifically those involving dairy farms. I'm also going to describe employers' responsibility for reporting serious injuries, briefly explain OSHA's inspection, exemption, and limitation directive. I'm going to include a reminder about posting your OSHA 300A summary sheets, and then I'll finish with a reminder about the rights of all workers as it relates to workplace safety and health. So let's take a look at the top 10 OSHA violations throughout the United States in FY21. This is a list of the top 10 most frequently cited standards in fiscal year 21, following inspections of work sites by federal OSHA. Again, this is throughout the country. The numbers in red is the position of the violation from the previous year. That would be FY20. Falls in construction continue to be the most cited OSHA standard and remain the leading cause of death in the construction industry. And you can see by this chart, 40% of the top 10 are related to fall hazards. But I want to draw your attention to hazard communication, which came in at number 5 last year, but it was number 2 in FY20. This standard consistently appears in OSHA's top 10 list each year. And it remains one of the most cited standards in OSHA inspections. So I further broke down the inspections in FY21, and I searched specifically for dairy farm inspections conducted by federal OSHA nationally in FY21. There were 15 of these inspections. The largest farm had 257 employees, and the smallest had about 12. The average size of farms that were inspected in FY21 were 57. 9 out of these inspections were the result of referrals to OSHA about a possible hazardous condition, and 4 of those were the result of the employer contacting OSHA to report an incident, which met the reporting requirements. Nearly a third of all the citations issued on dairy farms inspections nationally by OSHA in FY21 were hazard communication violations. They were for basic requirements of the HazCom standard. That is a written program, maintaining safety data sheets, employee training, and container and labeling. The second most frequently cited standard during these dairy farm inspections were the general duty clause. We issue general duty clause when there isn't a particular standard that OSHA has related to a hazard in the workplace. The general duty clause requires employers to provide a safe and healthy workplace for their employees. An example of these types of general duty clause violations were most related to fall protection. We had employees standing in buckets of front end loaders. We had employees not provided fall protection while they were shoveling snow off a barn roof, or employees were overloading an aerial lift. And one fatality investigation in Georgia was the result of employees parking too close to farm equipment storage locations and actually being struck by a farm equipment. And then the last most commonly issued citation for dairy farm inspections were failure to report serious incidents within 8 hours for fatalities and 24 hours for amputations, hospitalizations, or loss of an eye. These are the new penalty structures for FY22. Back in November of 2015, Congress passed a Federal Civil Penalties Inflation Adjustment Act. What this did was adjust the level of civil monetary penalties with a catch-up adjustment. And then more importantly, this bill made subsequent annual adjustments for inflation. So by January 15th of each year, OSHA issues its new penalties for that upcoming year. I'd like to briefly mention this OSHA directive and explain that it limits and exempts certain industries and businesses and NAICS codes from OSHA enforcement activity under the Appropriations Act. Specifically, it describes limiting inspections of those employers who employ 10 or fewer employees. Farms are specifically mentioned in Table 1 of the directive and exempts all OSHA activity on farms with 10 or fewer employees currently and at all times during the last 12 months, and has not had an active temporary labor camp during the preceding 12 months. So you can see by the chart, programmed inspections are not permitted, employee complaints are not permitted. Fatality and catastrophic events or accidents are not permitted for inspection by OSHA if the farm has currently 10 or fewer employees at all times during the last 12 months and has not had a temporary labor camp activity within the preceding 12 months. But if you don't fall into this category, if you have more than 10 employees at any point during the year, then you are required to report serious injuries and fatalities to OSHA. You have 8 hours to report a fatality and 24 hours to report inpatient hospitalization, an amputation, or an eye injury or an eye loss. You can do this online at osha.gov/report to make that report to OSHA. So just as a reminder, employers with greater than 10 employees at any time during the year must maintain an OSHA 300 log, except those industries listed in Appendix A of the subpart. And remember, this requirement applies to the size of the company, not the establishment. However, serious injuries or incidents, regardless of size, must be reported to OSHA. And this 300A summary sheet must be posted by February 1st of each year. So just wrapping up a few of the remaining slides that I have, protecting workers means not only complying with the regulations, but also making sure that employees have a legal right to raise safety and health concerns on the job without fear of retaliation. So among other protections, workers have the right to report unsafe working conditions to their manager and to OSHA, assist in an OSHA investigation, and request personal protective equipment and training to make sure they can do their job safely without exposure to hazards that can cause injury or illness. They also have whistleblower protection. It's against the law for employers to discipline or suspend their workers for reporting injuries or exercising other rights. Retaliation can include reducing pay or hours, firing, laying off, or suspending workers, or reassignment, or discipline, or demoting them, or threats, or harassment, or intimidation, and even blacklisting from hiring. So think about it. Would you rather hear a potential problem from your employee or from a government inspector? Or worse, not hear about it at all and then suffer a mishap or an injury? When a worker brings you a hazard or concern, you should welcome that comment and thank the worker and show initiative. And after the hazard has been managed, praise the worker in the presence of others to encourage more worker engagement in finding and fixing problems before they get hurt. So now let's turn to our main topic, hazard communications in an agriculture setting, and our guest speaker, Michelle Baker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Michelle Baker. Ms. Baker was available to us through one of our OSHA Alliance partners, the Society for Chemical Hazard Communications. OSHA's Alliance program enables the agency to develop voluntary, collaborative working relationships with organizations that are committed to workplace safety and health. OSHA joins with these groups committed to worker safety and health, including unions, consulates, trade or professional organizations, faith and community-based organizations, businesses, and educational institutions, to leverage our resources and expertise to help ensure safe and healthy workplaces and worker rights under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Ms. Baker has more than 25 years experience in product stewardship and regulatory compliance. She has a bachelor's of safety in occupational safety and health and a master's in public health. She is a certified hazardous materials manager and certified dangerous goods professional. She is a registered safety data sheet and label author by the American Industrial Hygiene Association Registry Program. She is currently employed at Zeon Chemicals, LP in Louisville, Kentucky, as their senior product stewardship manager. She is considered an expert in the field of hazard communications, hazardous materials management, chemical control regulations, and dangerous good transportation. Her responsibilities cover a wide range of regulatory requirements, including REACH, global chemical control legislation such as TSCA, and FDA, and product safety packaging and labeling regulations. So I'd like to turn the presentation over to Michelle. Michelle, take it away.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic, which is so important to me, and 25 years in the chemical industry, so important to worker safety. So the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard was envisioned in 1979 and enacted into law in 1983. Full compliance with the regulation came in 1986. So for nearly 40 years, this regulation has been a regular part of the broad breadth of regulations that OSHA has to keep workers safe. It deals primarily with hazardous chemicals in the workplace.
Michelle, you have accidentally muted yourself.
I apologize. The goal of the Hazard Communication Standard is to prevent accidents like the one that I show you here, where a metal worker died from an accidental ingestion of a chemical in the workplace. A chemical used to treat metal was placed in a Gatorade bottle. And it just so happened that the chemical itself was kind of a bright blue and looked just like Gatorade. He took one swig, realized what he had done, and spit it out. He got to a hospital immediately. He was taken there by a coworker. However, he died from the chemical exposure. The material was very caustic or acidic in his throat and caused systemic damage, and he passed away from these injuries. And this happened in 2006. That even as you know, here in the 2000s, that workers certainly have exposures to hazardous chemicals, and the HazCom standard was enacted to help employees understand and know the hazards. So the HazCom standard is commonly known as the right to know standard. Employees have the right to know about the hazards of the chemicals with which they work. In 2012, there was a major revision to the Hazard Communication Standard, and it was revised to harmonize with the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals, and is now known as the right to understand. So employees have the right to understand the hazards of the chemicals with which they work. The ultimate goal here, I think, with OSHA is that if you know that a chemical causes a terrible itchy rash, then you would take steps to keep it off of your skin. That's really the whole point, is that we provide access to information in the workplace so employees can make better decisions about how they use and protect themselves from the chemicals, hazardous chemicals in the workplace. So the HazCom standard has 5 essential elements. Number 1, safety data sheets. 2, labels. A list of hazardous chemicals, a written program, and all important training. And so these 5 parts work together to help employees understand the hazards of the chemicals with which they work. So under the HazCom standard, employers have certain responsibilities. They must make sure that labels are on incoming chemicals, on containers of incoming chemicals, or if chemicals are decanted into other containers of labels, that they're labeled again. If labels are defaced or become illegible, that labels are replaced. And you need to have a system in place in your workplace to label hazardous chemicals. You must maintain safety data sheets whenever you receive chemicals in. And if you don't get the safety data sheet when you receive chemicals into the workplace, then you need to obtain one by contacting the vendor or distributor. you have to make sure that SDS are available and accessible to your employees. You must make sure that all chemicals in the workplace are properly labeled, tagged, and marked. You must provide information and training to employees. And you must provide information if you have multi-employer workplaces. So if you have contractors on site, for example, you have a construction going on in your farm, the workers from that company who may be exposed to chemicals on your farm have the right to understand about the hazards of those chemicals, and you must disseminate that information to contract or other employers at your workplace. And lastly, you must develop, implement, and maintain a written hazard communication program. So all of these parts work together to make an overall hazard communication program, and this is how it works. So chemical manufacturers have a responsibility to evaluate their chemicals to understand the hazards, and then we must author safety data sheets and labels and make those available to the customers who purchase our chemicals. So that's my role in the industry. I work for a chemical manufacturer, and I prepare safety data sheets and labels that our customers use in their workplace to disseminate information to their employers. So you have that same obligation as you implement a program where where you receive the information from your vendors, from your suppliers, and then you make that information available to your employees. So from this point on, I would like to talk about the 5 elements of the hazard communication program and hopefully give you some tips for easy implementation at your work site. First, you're required to have a written program. So you have to develop a program that explains how you will label chemicals if they come in with a damaged or unreadable label. How you'll label chemicals that may be decanted from a large container, a 55-gallon drum, into a small sprayer, for example. What is your plan for doing this? Also, you have to have a systematic way to assign individuals the responsibility to obtain safety data sheets, file them, and make them available to your employees. So the written program is not meant to be a specific policy or cumbersome procedures that are difficult to maintain in your workplace. The best way to develop a written program is to just write down what it is that you do to make sure safety data sheets and labels are available for the hazardous chemicals in your workplace. I always recommend that folks not make huge policies that are difficult to maintain, but just give simple information about the things that you do and that your employees are trained to do to meet the requirements of the hazard communication standard. One requirement of the written program is that you have a list of hazardous chemicals present in your workplace. It seems like a daunting task, but it's impossible to know if you have an SDS for every chemical in your workplace if you don't even know what the chemicals are in your workplace. An inventory of hazardous chemicals should be developed and maintained. Also, safety data sheets for all hazardous chemicals must be available to employees. All chemical containers must be labeled, and you need to have a process for printing or writing labels for chemicals in the workplace. And finally, explain in brief detail about your training program, whether it's PowerPoint, how often you do it, explain how new employees are onboarded and they get information about where they find SDS and how to read chemical labels. So be sure to write down what you do and then follow those procedures to make sure that workers are trained, safety data sheets are available, and labels are on all hazardous chemicals. I did a simple search for a written program template. And as you can see, a simple Google search, there were many sample templates that you can pull from the web and then make them specific to your workplace. Be sure to identify the individuals who have specific responsibilities. For example, who is required to obtain safety data sheets? In my workplace, our purchasing person, the person who is our buyer, it is her responsibility to make sure that SDS are obtained when she orders chemicals. And then we have an administrative assistant who's responsible for filing and making SDS available. So it's as simple as make sure that you assign people to the task and then make sure that the task is getting done. And be sure to use the available resources from OSHA and other websites to develop a written program. It's low-hanging fruit for an OSHA inspection. This is an example of a chemical list. It does not have to be fancy. There's no specific information that has to be in the list except for the name of each hazardous chemical in the workplace. I think this list that says where you have to do an evaluation and see what the primary hazards are and put a location of where the chemical is stored or used is a good idea. That's not required, but you must have a list of hazardous chemicals in your workplace. After the written program, the Hazard Communication Program requires safety data sheets, or SDS. They must be available and accessible to all workers. You can't have safety data sheets in your file cabinet if your office is locked through some of the day or on weekends when workers may be exposed to the hazardous chemicals in their workplace. So it's important that safety data sheets are received for all hazardous chemicals in the workplace, and you have a systematic way of making these available to your employees, and that your employees know where to find them. They also need to know that these documents are for them. They're not trade secrets. They're not they're not property of your facility. Instead, these documents are meant to be handled, read, used, and trained for your employees. The globally harmonized system for classification and labeling of chemicals that was enacted in 2012 made a requirement that all safety data sheets now must be in the 16 section format. And so the information in section 2 is always hazard information. The information in section 8 is always PPE. And so there's now more clarity of information available in safety data sheets. If you have safety data sheets available for chemicals in your workplace that were authored before 2015, when the GHS became required in the United States, your SDS is out of date for sure, and you should ask your vendor for an updated SDS if the chemicals are still in your workplace. Again, for your written program, it's important who is responsible for acquiring and filing SDS. Someone should be assigned to this task. Where are safety data sheets located at your facilities? Are they in a file cabinet? Are they on a computer kiosk? Make sure that they're available at all times to employees, and they cannot be locked in an office, and an employee should not have to go to their supervisor and ask for a safety data sheet. They should be readily available so that workers have the right to this information. Also, a safety data sheet is required for every hazardous chemical in your workplace. The next part of the hazard communication program is labeling. All containers of hazardous chemicals must be labeled. A label is an immediate short warning or summary of the hazards and precautionary steps to protect workers from the chemical that they're using. So the information from the SDS is then distilled into a smaller, more summarized portion and placed onto the chemical label. The globally harmonized system and the revised HAZCOM standard now requires that hazardous chemicals have the same required information, no matter the manufacturer or the vendor. All hazardous chemicals must have the name, address, and telephone number of the person, of the company that is providing the chemical, the manufacturer or distributor. There's to be a product identifier, the name of the chemical or the trade name of the product, a signal word that helps to identify the degree of hazard, hazard statements, precautionary statements, and pictograms. Pictograms are new to the hazard communication standard. Pictograms help to educate employees about hazards, and it can transcend things like language barriers. The flame signal, our symbol, is known universally as to indicate a flammability hazard. And the globally harmonized system, or GHS, requires pictograms for certain hazardous chemicals and endpoints. So this is an example of a hazard communication label. You'll see the name, address, and telephone number and contact information for the supplier of the chemical or safety data sheet and label. Also, the product identifier. This name will be the same name that is on the safety data sheet. The product identifier is in section 1 of the safety data sheet and matches the name on the SDS. Most people know this as the trade name, right, of the chemical in question. Also, a signal word is required for some hazardous endpoints that describe the degree of danger. So if the word danger is on the label, that means that the chemical is more hazardous than a chemical that has the word warning. So warning is less hazardous, danger is more hazardous. And here is the pictogram that helps to convey information in a graphic way to employees who may handle or use the chemical. The GHS has 9 pictograms, and your employees should be trained on these pictograms so that when they see them on container labels, they have an understanding of what the hazards are of the chemical represented by the symbol. Some of these are fairly intuitive. So the skull and crossbones is universally known as a poison or toxic material. The flame I mentioned before is for flammable materials. But some of the other pictograms certainly need training and information for your employees. This exclamation mark is used for non-lethal acute hazards. The exploding man, that's what we call him, or the silhouette, is an indication of a chronic systemic hazard. For example, carcinogens have this symbol for health hazards. Other elements on a GHS or hazard communication label include hazard statements that are specifically printed on labels to describe the hazards that match the pictogram and the information that the chemical manufacturer has evaluated and understands about their chemical. These hazard statements are statutory. They're included in the OSHA regulation. I always tell folks that hazard communication is not creative writing. We want to use statements that have been tested, that have good comprehensibility for workers. Precautionary statements give short, brief details about things that you can do to protect yourself in case of a spill or to protect yourself from the hazards of the chemical. This is an example of a label that I got the picture. This is from a dairy farm. You may recognize the chemical, but you'll notice the pictograms. There's your signal word. I really challenge you to go back into your workplace today or this week and look at the chemicals that are in the workplace and be mindful of the GHS pictograms and hazard warnings that are now required under the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard for shipped containers. So understand that chemical manufacturers must use this type of label with this information to meet their requirements under the Hazard Communication Standard. I would like to point out, however, there are some special circumstances for dairy farms. In one case is sanitizers and pesticides. So sanitizing liquids or powders, sanitizing chemicals are regulated under EPA pesticide regulation. And the pesticide regulation under EPA has different labeling requirements. As part of a brief the brief safety orientation before I began my presentation, someone mentioned the EPA Worker Protection Program. That's EPA's Hazard Communication Program. So chemicals that are regulated under EPA will have an EPA pesticide label. And OSHA, therefore, makes the hazard communication label for the manufacturer exempt. So if you make a pesticide or a biocide under EPA, you do not have to use GHS pictograms and GHS precautionary and hazard phrases. Instead, you follow the rules for EPA pesticide labels. Now, while the labels may be exempt from OSHA, safety data sheets are still required if there is an exposure to these chemicals in the workplace. But understand that pesticide materials will not necessarily have GHS elements. Instead, they're labeled according to the pesticide rules. Also, veterinary medicines, they're regulated under FDA. And so OSHA exempts chemicals in the workplace that are labeled according to the FDA. However, if your employee does have exposures to these chemicals in the workplace, then a safety data sheet may be required. I think this is probably more likely with topical veterinary medicine applications. For example, I don't think that necessarily an injectable would be have an employee exposure routinely in the workplace, but you have to decide that for your own workplace. Where employees are exposed, have an exposure to hazardous chemicals, they need to have the information that is available in a safety data sheet. And the label, however, will come from the FDA or the EPA. Notice here is the same Mark 10. This is the safety data sheet for the chemical that I showed in the last slide, the sanitizer. There is an SDS on the company's website, and there are GHS classifications, although those aren't represented necessarily on the label. I'm sure the label does say something about skin corrosivity, but there would not be a pictogram necessarily because of the EPA required label. So I've spent some time talking about labels for shipped containers as they are received from chemical manufacturers or your distributors and vendors. However, there's another label that's commonly used and required under the HAZCOM standard, and we call these workplace labels. These are labeling systems that the workplace develops to label things that are decanted into smaller or other containers, where labels are defaced or become illegible. We call these workplace labels or secondary labels. Understand that the elements required for the GHS are not required on workplace labels. You are allowed to duplicate the label that was on the original label. That's perfectly acceptable and actually is a pretty good idea. But if you have a different workplace process for labeling hazardous chemicals, as long as your employees understand and use the labeling system and know what the hazards mean and where they can get more information, there's no specific requirements for secondary labels, except you need a product identifier and some information about the hazard. So for secondary labels, I want to ask you for your written program, what is the procedure when labels become damaged or illegible? This is an example of a chemical, a picture that I took from a dairy farm. You may recognize the chemical, but this label certainly has had a hard life. And certainly when labels become illegible, you must have a program in place to replace that label. Also, how will you label dilute solution of concentrated chemicals? Often the sanitizers that you purchase for the use in the dairy are diluted and then used in a separate container from the original container that you purchased from the vendor. How will you label those newly decanted chemicals? You need to have a plan in place. And our example of the Gatorade bottle that was used to hold the metalworking chemical, it seems far-fetched, but I'm telling you, this happens very commonly. It is very common for people to take chemicals from their original large container and put it into a smaller container. And when there is no label, if there's an accident or a spill, how will your employees know what was spilled and what they need to do? So you need to have a plan in place for labeling those types of chemicals in the workplace. OSHA does allow you to continue to use HMIS or NFPA labels if you used them before the HAZCOM standard was revised. Whatever system you use is okay as long as employees are trained and they understand what the information on the workplace label means and where they can get more information about the chemical in their workplace. You can easily find with a simple Google search GHS type workplace labels. These are not required by OSHA, although I certainly recommend the use of labels like that so that your employees get used to seeing and understanding the GHS pictograms. Also, you can directly get the information from the SCS so you know which one of these symbols that you would keep on the label. So notice there's a product identifier, you write the name of the chemical, and then you would mark out the pictograms that do not apply and leave only the ones showing that do apply. So these are simple and inexpensive ways to label chemicals in the workplace. And the last and final part of the HAZCOM standard is training. And OSHA says that there must be effective training for employees. They must be trained before their initial assignment, and they must be trained when new hazards are introduced into the workplace. So if there are new pictograms, a type of hazard that was not seen before, or new chemicals into the workplace, you must have a way to train and disseminate that information. Things that must be included in training include, how do you know if a chemical is hazardous? How do you, what will it smell like? What does it look like? What container is it in? Where do we store hazardous chemicals? Those are the kind of things that you would train. You need to train on the hazards of the chemicals in your workplace. I searched around for chemicals commonly used in dairies, and there's a lot of chemicals that are corrosive that burn the skin and eyes. There are many chemicals that are oxidizers and can cause other chemicals to react to present a fire or reactivity hazard. Whatever the hazards are of the chemicals in your workplace, that is the information that employees must have. And you must train employees in a language that they understand and use. I can speak for most chemical manufacturers in that safety data sheets are commonly available in Spanish, Portuguese, Vietnamese, etc., that for the employees in your workplace that may not use English as their first language. I checked chemical websites for dairy farm chemicals, and many of the websites had SDS available, and they had SDS available in both English and Spanish. That was common, but be sure to ask your vendors for this information and make them available to your workers if a safety data sheet in a language which is not English is important to your workplace. You must train employees on appropriate protective measures. If the SDS in Section 8 says that you must use gloves, then you must make gloves available and train your employees on how to use, maintain, and dispose of gloves. Also, they need to know where and how to obtain additional information. Non-routine tasks. What do you do if there's a spill? Where are spill response kits? Are there special requirements for spills of certain hazardous chemicals in your workplace? You need to evaluate this information and then train your employees. I want to say, lastly, that if you don't have a record of your training, it never happened. So it is very important that you document training. Sign-in sheets, quizzes, etc., are a good way to show that you did do the training. OSHA does not specify what kind of training materials you must use. It does depend on what hazards are in your workplace, but OSHA does say that you must have a training program for hazard communication, and you need to keep records of that training. We have some resources here. there is an article in Progressive Dairy that I found about the Hazard Communication Standard, and it really was the best article I've ever seen on just where the rubber meets the road, easy, basic information on how to build a hazard communication program on your farm. It was in plain language, good, common sense advice, and I highly recommend that you check out this article. A simple Google search for hazard communication and progressive dairy, and I'm sure you'll find it on your computer. OSHA also has a publication for small entities so that they can comply with the HazCom standard. And it's available on the OSHA website. So in summary, the hazard communication is based on a simple concept. The employees have both a need and the right to know and understand the hazards and the identities of the chemicals that they are exposed to when working. Employees have the right to know this information. And armed with this information, they can make better choices to protect themselves and to handle chemicals properly. Also, chemicals need to know what protective measures are available in your workforce, in your workplace, to protect them from the hazardous chemicals that you purchase and use. With this slide, I am happy to answer any questions. And certainly, if you have more questions about your HazCom program or particulars, please reach out to Nick or Kyle, and they can give you my contact information, and it will make my day if you have a question or need some help. This really is a passion for me, and I've done it going on 30 years, and I would be more than happy to help you.
Thank you, Michelle, for that. So I think this is a question kind of towards Nick and Jim to start off our question and answer period. Are family members considered employees?
The answer to that is no, they're not considered employees.
Okay.
And Nick, that would be like the immediate family members of the farm owner, correct?
Correct. Right, Jim, that's right. Immediate family members are not considered employees, correct?
Okay.
So that would include like uncles or cousins that were working at the farm.
Right.
Nick, I think you can elaborate this on a little bit more, and Jim as well, and I think Michelle too. Dairy workers, we had a comment come in, dairy farm workers could get exposure to animal drugs through a needle stick injury. From an OSHA's perspective, Nick, how would that get reported? And then Michelle, from a kind of a HazCom exposure as well.
So, I mean, that doesn't necessarily need to get reported to OSHA unless it results in a hospitalization. So that would be the only reporting to OSHA. If it did involve medical treatment or medical care, which again, depending on circumstances, it might, then it would go on the OSHA log as a recordable, but it would cross the threshold once that employee would require hospitalization, and then a call to OSHA must be made within 24 hours if the other criteria are met, if you have more than 10 employees and so on. But you know, that would be the threshold, the hospitalization. And then medical treatment, it would go on the OSHA log if the farm is required to keep one.
Okay. Anything to add?
Oh, go ahead. I'd like to add that there are some rules under the bloodborne pathogens regulation for OSHA that may apply here with needle sticks. I did look at SDS for some chemicals that I found in the dairy farm that I had access to, And I looked at those safety data sheets, and in some cases, there was no hazard. It did not meet the criteria under the GHS to be an irritant, etc. So the example I looked at was the lidocaine. The picture I showed you was lidocaine, and the SDS said that there were no hazards, although the SDS should give you information about the hazards of that chemical and what to do in case of an exposure. In section 4 would be first aid. In section 11 would be toxicity information. So the SDS is required for those kind of chemicals on your workplace, at your workplace where there could be an exposure. And the SDS does give you a great deal of information on how to respond to an emergency, such as a needle stick or other exposure. So just because the medicine, our veterinary medicines fall under FDA and are labeled under the FDA guidelines, they're still evaluated by their manufacturer, and SDS are readily available on the websites from those vendors, and you should have them available to your workers, especially if they have a potential exposure.
Okay. So a lot of dairy farms nowadays are doing pre-dip and post-dip. Some farms are buying it as a concentrate, so it arrives on the phone as a concentrate, and a lot of people are switching from cups to automatic hoses straight into the parlor. Is a diluted label or a dilute label needed, and where's the best place for that label to be placed and for employee information?
A great question. I did look at the websites of some dairy farm chemical vendors, and some vendors actually had SDS available for their recommended dilution product. So if they were asking you to dilute 1 to 250, for example, they had the SDS available. The vendor also, so I would first check with your vendor and check out their website. So if they have a common dilution factor, they may have an SDS available for that. The information on the pesticide label may also give information about the hazards of the dilute solution. So the EPA label, when we're talking about sanitizers or things that are regulated under EPA. I think if I could not get information on the dilute material, I would take worst case and communicate hazards of the concentrate. It's better than being underprotected. Now, for those things in tank systems, lines, OSHA does require that the chemicals in those systems where there could be an employee exposure, you need to have an SDS on site. Now, labels may be separate in that they may be worksheets or SOPs. You could have a copy of the hazard label there. You can use tags that may hang from the piping system or the hose that that you're using. If you look at some of the general vendors for hazard communication labels, these durable tags are commonplace, and you can place them on hoses, nozzles, tanks, etc. Whatever method you use, it's okay. I've seen situations where you get a laminated pocket folder, and you put the safety data sheet or a copy of the label and stick it to the side of a tank. And so your employees know. It can be in work instructions, in binders, near the equipment. But whatever you do, whatever works for your workplace is acceptable as long as your employees know and are trained on where to look and where they can find information. So there are many options for those kind of situations, but commit to something, make it procedure, and train employees on where they get information.
Great. So a question for you, Nick. OSHA 300A summaries are posted. Is there also a refiling required also for this? This farm has asked in the past, we were notified via email to file this information online, but once like every 4 years or so.
Right. So if you receive a request from OSHA for your information on the 300A, then you're required to provide that information to OSHA. However, the electronic reporting, I don't believe farms are included in the establishment size or the industries listed in the NAICS code for electronic reporting. But if you are requested by OSHA to submit that, you are then required to submit that data or that information to OSHA.
Okay. Michelle, can you expand a little bit more on the possibility of SDS sheets kept in an electronic format?
Yeah, so OSHA has an interpretation document, and they allow you to manage SDS in a web-based or an online or a computer-based format. The only requirement is that your employees must have access to a computer kiosk. It cannot be a situation where only a supervisor or a foreman, for example, has an office and a computer, but employees don't have a login for that computer. You can't use a computer to maintain SDS if workers don't have access. But if you have a tablet or a computer kiosk where employees can access the information and have been trained on how to use that, how to get the information out of the computer, then electronic storage is perfectly okay. You do need to have a backup plan in case of system outages, for example, in the case of an emergency. At our workplace, we have the SDS downloaded to a portable hard drive that can be taken off site and put into a laptop or whatever, and SDS pulled up. It was that simple. Or you could just say, if the electricity, et cetera, is out and the computer's not available, then we're going to stop work with hazardous chemicals. Your workplace can decide what your backup plan is, but you should have, that should be some consideration. So certainly electronic filing and access of safety data sheets is allowed, but be sure you meet the requirements for employee access and backup.
Okay. I think you touched on this a little bit, Michelle, but say a farm has several containers of hazardous chemicals that have been around for quite a few years, and they still have the labels on them, but do they have to change the label to comply with the hazardous comms requirement?
No. So when the HAZCOM standard was revised, the revised standard happened in 2012. Manufacturers were required to have labels updated by 2015. So if you have chemicals hanging out from before 2015, you do not have to change them to GHS labels if they're in the workplace. The only caveat to that would be if you're going to ship containers. So if your farm, if you have a couple of farms in the same area and you share chemicals, I think that could be a possibility. Or your property is somehow divided so that you are hauling chemicals along the road to a new site, then the shipped container requirements would apply with all of the GHS HAZCOM requirements. So, but for just in the workplace where you're not going to ship those chemicals, it is perfectly okay to leave the labels. But I would recommend, if you've got chemicals hanging out from 2015, maybe you should think about proper disposal. In my experience, few folks trust chemicals that get that old to be effective and useful.
Okay. Nick, you had an additional comment about the 300A?
Yes, Kyle, please. Yes, thank you. So establishments, if your establishment, that's one particular location, has 250 or more employees and you're required to keep the OSHA 300 log, then you must electronically report to OSHA, and the deadline is March 2nd. Now, if your establishment has between 20 to 249, agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting, NAICS code that begins with 11 must file electronically by March 2nd. So I want to correct and amend my previous statement. However, if you do receive a direct request from OSHA for submission of your injury data, then you must comply with that. So again, over 250 at a particular establishment that currently keep an OSHA 300 log, you must electronically report. And if you have between 20 to 200, to 249 employees under NAICS code that begins with 11, and dairy is 11212, then you must electronically report by March 2nd. And you can find that at OSHA.gov/injury reporting.
Great.
Thank you, Kyle.
Yeah, no problem. So I think we've had a lot of great information here today. Thank you to all of our presenters. Nick, Jim, or Michelle, any closing thoughts as we wrap up here?
This is Jim. I just want to thank Farm Credit East for taking the time to let us present on this important subject and to make farm safety an important topic for the producers out there.
Yes, this is Nick. I'd like to echo my appreciation to Farm Credit East for sponsoring and holding this webinar today. I also like to extend a thank you to Michelle Baker for her time and her great information on hazard communications, and also for the Society for Chemical Hazard Communications, of which she is a member. I can't stress enough that consistently HAZCOM, hazard communication violations, compliance with hazard communication consistently appears in the top 10 OSHA violations each year. And as Michelle pointed out, it's been a regulation that's been around for a long time. So it's important for both the employer and the employees to know about the chemicals and the chemical hazards they have and how best to protect employees against those hazards. So thank you.
Great. So I think, oh, Michelle.
I was just going to say thanks for inviting me. It has been an honor. So nice to meet you all.
So with that, just a reminder to everybody that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to farmcrediteast.com/webinars, as well as our YouTube channel. Just simply search Farm Credit East and we will pop right up. With that, I wish everybody a great afternoon and a happy weekend.